And welcome. Thank you very much for joining this session today on aligning long-term strategies with NDCs. My name is Sarah Sheshia. I'm a senior associate at the 2050 Pathways platform, and I'm delighted to be moderating today's panel. We're joined by a fantastic panel of speakers today, which I'll introduce very shortly. But before we hear from our speakers, I wanted to provide a little bit of context to this webinar. Next, please. Great, thank you. So this session is taking place as part of the 2050 is Now webinar series, which we kicked off last month with the first session that explores lessons learned around the development of long-term low-emission development strategies, which you may know as LT-LEDs or LTS. And so today we're back with our second webinar of the series, which will explore the topic of alignment between LT-LEDs and NDCs. And so this challenge of alignment between short-term and long-term action really lies at the core of the 2050 is Now project, which is making this webinar series possible today. So the project goals are highlighted here, but to kind of give you a bit of a summary of what we're trying to achieve, really the project is looking to strengthen long-term strategies, as well as identify opportunities to enhance NDCs, and finally to advance key development objectives in countries. And so these goals are being met through research and capacity building activities in selected countries, as well as global knowledge sharing convenings like this webinar, but also in-person annual convenings that we organize with consortium partners. Next, please. Oh, the one. Yes, thank you very much. So the project is currently active in Argentina, India, Indonesia, and Brazil, but we're also supporting efforts in Mexico, Colombia, Benin, Ethiopia, and South Africa through the NDC Partnership's global call on NDCs and LT-LEDs. And so as you can see here, we have a variety of partners involved in the project. And in fact, we lead this project as a consortium. And these partners include Fundación Bariloche, IDRI, the National Renewable Energy Lab, Sustainable Development Solutions Network, WRI Global, as well as WRI offices in India, Indonesia, and Brazil, and the 2050 Pathways platform. And we've been very pleased to be part of this consortium. So now that I've provided a bit of background about the webinar series and the broader 2050 is Now project, I wanted to set the scene a little bit on LT-LEDs and NDC alignment and why this webinar today. Next, please. And so first taking you through the foundations of LT-LEDs and NDC alignment. So you may already know that LT-LEDs and NDCs were established in the Paris Agreement initially, but through the UNFCCC process and global key global climate events, the importance to align long-term strategies and nationally determined contributions has been reinforced throughout the years. For instance, in the Glasgow Climate Pact in 2021, following COP26, but more recently as well through the Global Stocktake, which under Article 40 explicitly encouraged parties to align the next NDCs with LT-LEDs. Next, please. And this year, we know that countries are highly focused on formulating their next round of NDCs, which will showcase their 2035 milestones. The next NDCs, as you may know, were due in February 2025, and we've had 19 submissions to the UNFCCC so far. But we know that about half of the pending submissions are now expected by the UN General Assembly at around September of this year. So knowing that, we think that there's still a key opportunity to ensure that these next NDCs are aligned with long-term objectives. In the meantime of this NDC formulation effort, we know that there's a continued exercise to develop LT-LEDs from some of these countries, with over 30 countries either preparing their LT-LEDs for the first time or revising an existing LT-LEDs. On top of this, beyond the kind of LT-LEDs process and document as such, we know that over 100 countries have made national net zero commitments, yet many of these countries aren't so clear through an LT-LEDs, for instance, on how they plan to reach this goal. So again, there's really a key, quite short, but key window of opportunity to consider how short-term plans and long-term plans can speak to each other and align cohesively. Interestingly, we also wanted to highlight some data that we received from the NDCP Global Call, which we work with closely. And they highlighted that 43 requests that they received, so when I say requests, I mean kind of support requests from countries, that 43 of these cover both NDCs and LT-LEDs. And although in many countries it's clear how those two processes speak to each other through these requests, in many of those requests received, it's still unclear how the country plans to tackle both at the same time and simultaneously. Next, please. So knowing this, this webinar really is an opportunity to have an open discussion with experts and country representatives, and understanding that NDC and LT-LEDs alignment isn't a one-size-fits-all. It's still an evolving area of work. Countries are still facing many questions and challenges in the process, but really today is an attempt to highlight some of the best practices that can be considered for alignment, but also honestly talk about the challenges that governments are facing when looking to align those two processes. Again, as I mentioned, there's an increased recognition of the key role that LT-LEDs can play as a roadmap to enhance NDCs and strengthen their credibility. But there's also multiple challenges faced by countries. So to name a few, and we'll delve deeper into this in the presentations, but to name a few, misaligned timelines between the two processes, a lack of capacity, but also sometimes different teams, different assumptions being used across the two processes. And again, those not necessarily speaking to each other. So really in this context, the need for practical tools, practical experiences is very crucial to make sure that this alignment agenda can move forward. Next, please. So in light of all the context provided now, it's my pleasure to introduce our panel today. As you can see, we have a variety of speakers from different organizations and who will provide different perspectives to this topic. So we will first hear from Clea Schumer and Kieran Mishka-Reeds from the WRI team, who will tell us a bit more about a methodology that they've developed to assess NDCs in relation to the 1.5 goal and national net zero goals. We'll then zoom in on NDC alignment with LT-LED specifically with Anna Perez-Catala from IDRI, who will tell us a bit more about a framework developed at the end of last year to align LT-LEDs and NDC, both from a policy content perspective as well as through practical steps. After hearing from experts, we'll turn to country representatives who will give us practical examples of how they've gone about alignment in their respective countries. We'll hear first from Camila Labarca from the Ministry of Environment of Chile, who will tell us about the practical steps that were taken in Chile to align LT-LEDs and NDCs. And last but not least, we will hear from Meli Ferhat Hayaz from the Directorate of Climate Change of Turkey on the experience in approaching alignment between the two processes. And just to note to let you know that once these presentations are completed, we will leave some time for Q&A. So we invite you to submit questions through the Q&A tool at the bottom of your screen. So we can select a few questions at the end of the presentation and answer them with the panel. And finally, a quick note that we will be recording the session today and it will be made available on the event page in a few days. So in case you would like to share this with colleagues, you may do so. Okay, so with that in mind and without further ado, it's my pleasure to give the floor to Clea Schumer to set the stage. So Clea, over to you.
Thank you, Sarah, and thanks everyone for being here. It's a pleasure to share more about work we've done at WRI to assess alignment of NDCs with the global 1.5 degree goal and with countries' own net zero targets. Next slide, please. So just to start with some basic definitions, as Sarah mentioned, policy discourse has increasingly called for aligning NDCs with long-term mitigation objectives, but parties under the Paris Agreement have not formally agreed on what such alignment would absolutely require. There are different conceptualizations and definitions that one could consider, but one relatively straightforward approach is to think about when a party's near-term NDC emissions target aligns with an emissions trajectory that is compatible with limiting warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius or achieving that party's stated net zero target. And just to draw a quick link between those two end goals, if every country were to achieve net zero by mid-century, we could collectively limit warming to 1.5 degrees. And so that's the draw between the two end goals there. On to the next slide, please. So when countries are seeking to develop NDC targets that are both ambitious and aligned with the long-term mitigation goals that I mentioned, that's 1.5 degree alignment and alignment with a net zero target, countries can ask, what mitigation benchmarks must we reach by 2030, by 2035, and the years thereafter to stay on a compatible emissions trajectory? And forthcoming analysis at WRI provides 2030 and 2035 benchmarks for high-emitting economies that are aligned with both that global 1.5 degree goal and with emitters' own previously articulated net zero targets for the target year that they have articulated. Next slide, please. So at WRI, in this forthcoming piece, we compile benchmarks from leading sources in several categories. And I just want to mention that different corners of the climate community clearly use different methods to define what a 1.5 degree pathway, to define what targets would be aligned with a 1.5 degree pathway, or what targets would be aligned with a country or an emitter's net zero target. And so we compile benchmarks from numerous leading sources in different categories to highlight what an ambitious and aligned landing zone for countries' upcoming NDCs would look like that would be aligned with those long-term goals. So when you think about the 1.5 degree goal, you can think about pathways that achieve global 1.5 degrees and divide the mitigation burden by cost and optimize for least cost contributions from countries. How could countries contribute most cost effectively to achieving the global goal? You can think about fair share based contributions to the global 1.5 degree goal, and a variety of studies that we include consider these fair share and equity-based contributions like historical responsibility as well as present-day capacity to act. Then when you're thinking about countries' own net zero targets, you can look at modeled pathways to a country's net zero target, which take into account different policies and measures in countries that get them from emissions today to their 2050 or 2060 target. And even this relatively straightforward approach that has emerged in recent months since the last COP to draw a straight line from present emissions levels to countries' net zero targets. And again, this follows from a coalition of nations at the COP committing to straight line or steeper emissions reductions to net zero. And so we can think about different benchmarks yielded by each of these approaches and again get a sense of what an ambitious landing zone for countries' NDCs would look like. So I will now pass to my colleague Kieran to share some of our findings for a few case studies. Thank you.
Thanks, Clea. And hi, everyone. Now we're going to get into some of our results. Just want to note that these are preliminary numbers with the final version to be released in our forthcoming piece in a slightly different visual format. But we are nevertheless super excited to share some of our findings with you. So starting here with Indonesia, we can see that their existing 2030 targets, those are the ones in the little red dots, are only compatible with national modeling to net zero by 2060. And this modeling comes from the Low Carbon Development Indonesia Initiative, LCDI, which was developed in close cooperation with the Indonesian government, and from the Deep Decarbonization Pathways Initiative, which is led by Idris. So, and I will present, she's from Idris, so good to have her representation here as well. And while Indonesia's existing targets are on a net zero trajectory, they would need to increase the strength of their 2030 target to align with 1.5 degree least cost pathways. But turning now to 2035, we see considerable overlap between net zero aligned pathways. So that's the blue area between the teal and the purple for 2035. But once again, we see that 1.5 degree aligned least cost pathways suggest that more ambition is needed. And then we propose that Indonesia's new NDC could, for example, exhibit a range of ambition by including an unconditional target aligned with trajectories to net zero by 2060, as well as a target conditional on receiving international support that reflects the deeper greenhouse gas emissions reductions that are required by 1.5 degree aligned least cost pathways. And finally, looking at fair share numbers, which remember, they take into account historical emissions and income level. These imply that the flattening emission level between 2030 and 2035. And as these don't include emissions from land use change, and forestry, you can consider these to be a fair share estimate of how the rest of Indonesia's economy needs to decarbonize, with, of course, the note that the LULUCF emissions are very important to Indonesia. So moving now to the European Union, we can see that the EU's existing 2030 target in their NDC is on a straight line trajectory to net zero and just above the 1.5 degree aligned least cost range. And the most interesting thing to talk about is actually, in our limited time here, the beyond 2030. So EU's 2035 and 2040 targets are currently a topic of active political debate. The EU is working on legislating their 2040 target prior to finalizing their 2035 target. And the European Commission has proposed a 90% reduction from 1990 levels by 2040, which again is still being actively debated. And then based on the ending points for drawing straight lines, the EU is considering reductions in the range of 66% to 72.5% by 2035. And again, this is compared to historical emissions in 1990. And the way they get that range is they draw a straight line starting in 2030, either ending in net zero for the 66% number, or ending in the 90% emissions reduction by 2040. And so that gets you a slightly different, if you think about it, slightly different slope, and gets you a slightly different number in 2035. So when you compare those numbers, which are actively being debated, to our benchmarks, we see that the higher end would be compatible with 1.5 degree aligned least cost pathways, while the lower end is more aligned with straight lines to net zero. And the reason why our straight line range is a bit bigger is because we drew them on slightly different starting points as well. So finally, looking at fair share pathways, we see that significantly greater ambition is required, even beyond the EU's decarbonization capacity internally. And so this would require greater climate finance to support international emissions reductions or removals. Next slide, please. So finally, none of the major emitters that we assess in our forthcoming analysis have 2030 or 2035 targets that meet all of our assessed benchmarks for ambition. And so, broadly speaking, our current national climate commitments do fall short of the mitigation that we need. And in some cases, countries even fail to meet their own net zero pledges. So increased ambition from all countries, especially major emitters, is crucial in this moment to ensure that long-term targets are achievable. And just to wrap up, it is imperative that countries submit these ambitious commitments before the UN General Assembly meeting in September. Under the Paris timeline, most NDCs were actually due in February. But so far, as Sarah mentioned, there were only been 19 submitted so far, which cover just 21% of global emissions. At this moment, quality and ambition must take priority. So we would like to see countries taking a little bit of the extra time, but submitting strong commitments aligned with long-term goals before the UN General Assembly, which would allow for international scrutiny ahead of COP30 in Brazil this November. That's all for me. Thanks, Sarah.
Thank you, Clea and Kieran, for this very comprehensive overview of the methodology that you've used. I think it's really interesting, actually, how your assessment, first of all, shed lights on the increased ambition needed in NDCs to meet the 1.5 goal, but also sometimes national net zero goals that are not actually being met through the current progress. And I think it's a really nice segue as well to talk about LT-LEDs as a key tool that can enable this increased ambition in NDCs. And so I'm turning to Ana Perez-Catala from IDRI to tell us a bit more about a resource that was developed at the end of last year by IDRI in partnership with the 2050 Pathways platform to really delve into a more precise framework that can enable alignment between both processes, and that is NDCs and LT-LEDs. So over to you, Anna.
Thank you very much, Sarah, and thanks to WRI and the platform for this excellent collaboration and the organization of the webinar. As Sarah mentioned, the presentation focuses on this tool and this guide that we elaborated together at the end of last year. So if we move directly to the next slide, please. So what is alignment? We had a very good definition already from our colleagues at WRI. Here I'm turning to let's say a bit broader scope of alignment, mentioning that what it means for this guide is to align, is a process to align or to ensure that the short-term plans, such as the NDCs, are designed to support or contribute to these long-term objectives that the Paris Agreement is bringing. And this brings a set of benefits that I have listed. This can bring greater policy coherence. It can bring better integration between sectors or different scales. It can bring enhanced ambition, or even promote operational efficiency between like different ministries or different actors. These would all also bring credibility in climate commitments, and all that will enhance the ability to attract investments. So quite a lot of benefits in looking at alignment, when considering that. And we are mentioning this in the context of what has already been said, but I'll just briefly repeat that, saying that there's a broad consensus that alignment needs to happen. It has been mentioned in the UNFCCC and beyond, but it's unclear yet how to do it. And here is where we are trying to look at a very practical framework to do so. So let's go to the next slide, please, and look into that. Next slide, please. Yes, perfect. As Sarah was already hinting, we are looking at LT-LEDs as a tool that really helps align the Paris Agreement with this more shorter-term goals, such as the NDCs. The framework is built on this premise that countries can fully understand how their NDC aligns with the Paris Agreement by viewing it through the lens of the elements that an LT-LEDs provides. So this is the little orange balls that I put here, right? Like you have the Paris Agreement goals, but if you're unsure how to reach that, the elements provided by an LT-LEDs can really help you see how you translate that into an NDC. Why? Because having an LT-LEDs helps reveal some specific transformations and actions that you would not have considered, or it's more difficult to consider them with a more short-term vision, and therefore it opens the scope for the process of alignment. But what are those elements that an LT-LEDs provides that really make it a good eye-opener for alignment? For example, it makes explicit some drivers of the sectoral transformations that need to happen, or it shows the interplay between different time horizons. So if you know that you have to reach a certain goal in the long term, it helps you see what are the next steps that you really have to do tomorrow or in the next NDC. Of course, this brings many challenges as well. For example, the LT-LEDs tends to bring a more like normative view that will have to be confronted with what's happening currently in the country with the current political economy. But a very key challenge that was mentioned before is the absence of LT-LEDs in many countries. That, of course, can be failed with like looking at some long-term visions or other documents, but it's also a struggle. And there are other challenges that Sarah also mentioned at the beginning, because sometimes the timelines are misaligned between NDCs and LT-LEDs, or there's coordination gaps that need to be solved. Let's look at the next slide, please. So I appreciate this is a very busy slide, so I'll walk you through it. This is the framework that we have developed that proposes a certain number of questions to help a country go through alignment. On the left, you have the questions that a country has to ask to work on alignment on the content. So here there are 5 questions. The first one, which was really well addressed by our colleagues at WRI before, which is there an LTLED or an net zero target, and has it been reflected in a way that you have looked and how the NDC is responding to that? But then there are other questions on if there are already short-term and medium-term targets that have been included as milestones and therefore contribute to the longer-term transformations. The third question looks more like at actions and policies and that should be implemented in the short to medium term to align again with the longer-term neutrality objective. Then the fourth one looks at the GSC outcomes, which ones have been included and how they have taken into account. And finally, we ask where cooperation would be key to achieve these climate priorities so countries can signal that in their NDCs as well. This is per content, and if we go to the right side of the infographic, you will see the questions that you have to align on processes, which we divided in 3 categories. You have coordination. For example, we have mentioned several times how different ministries may be involved and they have to be coordinated. Then we have inclusion, for example, the involvement of stakeholder groups in consultations for the NDCs and for the LTLEDs, and if they can be similar in both processes. And then finally, planning and policy coherence, which looks at if regulations are in place, such as a law, for example, to ensure that there's alignment. Next slide, please. So, of course, this can become a bit theoretical without having specific country examples, and we will hear from very good ones later on. In the case of the guide, we asked for specific experts to work on 4 specific case studies for the European Union, for Morocco, for Chile, and for India. And I tried to give like a bit of a flavor of the type of things that you can find in there. So, for example, on alignment on content, you can see a very key example that is mostly known is how the European Union shows NDC and LTLEDs alignment with the net zero targets, which is what we were trying to discuss also before. The EU has short-term and medium-term targets with goals for 2030 and for 2040 that are aligned or are supposed to be aligned with the net zero objective. For example, the case study of Morocco also showed how a country can include the sectoral target in the NDC because the last NDC for Morocco has a specific target for renewable energy, for instance. And if you look at the case study for India, the authors suggested how India could include some of the global stocktake signals into its NDC and which international cooperation would be needed to achieve the goals of the NDC, putting emphasis on technology transfer and financial support. And then these are some examples for how alignment on content works, but then there were also some examples on process that I wanted to highlight. For example, we were talking about coordination. So, for example, Morocco had a coordination among different sectoral ministries to define the new NDC. We will hear Chile just now, but they had a very broad stakeholder process shaping the LTLEDs. And in terms of planning, for example, Europe has the European climate law, as well as other countries, that serves as this framework which really sets more like the process of alignment and how the NDC and the LTLEDs should be connected. So final slide, please. Thank you. We move to the final one. To the next one. No, sorry, I meant the previous one. Sorry about that. But yeah, it's the only one that has text, I promise. With all this in mind, these ideas on how do you align by looking at the really long-term transformations needed by looking at the LTLEDs. We wrote a policy brief as EG that is coming out tomorrow, so very good timing. And I put here some of the ideas that really relate to NDCs. And here we draw on 3 specific considerations that we think people should take into account when assessing new NDCs. So new NDCs will be delivered now. We want to look at 3 specific things. First, if you look for inclusion of long-term system transformations as part of this alignment, this will reveal that the NDC is doing a good job, and some of these transformations will be already part of the global stocktake. If the NDC focuses on these transformations or addresses these transformations, this could create a sense of more, let's call it constructive differentiation, because it will allow countries to pursue national strategies that are beneficial for their own country, for their economy, while also supporting climate ambition. And then focusing on these transformations will also strengthen action and ambition at a global level, because it would send signals to the economic actors that are shaping those actions. So with that, we are now really going to the last slide, where I've left the QR code for and the links that we can also put in the chat of the guide I was discussing, of the report, the DDP annual report, which is providing insights on the transformations needed through a detailed analysis in 10 countries, and yet to be published, the brief that will come out tomorrow with this information. So thank you very much again, and yeah, back to you, Sarah.
Thank you very much for the great presentation, Anna. It's great to see you present the framework, and I think it was really valuable how you highlighted some of the case study examples as well from the guide, and to see really how we can move from this kind of theoretical almost framework to really practical implementation of the steps to align LTLEDs and NDCs. So thank you very much for that. And similarly to Kieran, it's a very nice segue to our next speaker, Camila Lebarca from the Ministry of Environment of Chile, who will tell us a little bit more about the experience of Chile in practically aligning LTLEDs and NDCs. It's a pleasure to have you with us, Camila, and over to you.
Thank you, Sarah. I'll wait for my slides to be shown. Okay. So just next slide, please. Well, so regarding the alignment of NDCs and long-term climate strategies in the experience of Chile, well, first of all, we have now a framework law, which is our climate change framework law from 2022, which states by law that we will be carbon GHG neutral at the latest by 2050. And this law also recognized the existence of the NDCs, the long-term climate strategy, and other sectorial plans and subnational plans. Within the law, it states also the relationship within these different instruments. So the long-term climate strategy has to be aligned with the NDC, and then all the sectorial plans and subnational plans has to be aligned with these national broader plans. So before the climate change framework law, we already had an NDC from 2020 and a long-term climate strategy from 2021. And now the law states that the NDCs has to be updated every 5 years and the long-term climate strategy every 10 years. But also states that after a new NDC, we have to review our current long-term climate strategy so they can be aligned. So we are currently updating our NDC. And we will have to update or review our current long-term climate strategy second semester of this year and next year. But in the process of developing these two strategies, as they have to be aligned and the long-term strategy is after the NDC, it's harder to align a long-term view after you have the short-term one. So we're actually developing both processes a little bit in parallel. So we're planning through scenarios, future scenarios, and we are looking to meet the 2050 target of GHG neutrality to set both the NDC and the long-term climate strategy. The next one, please. Yeah, so I'll tell a little bit about the current process, more than the one that was in 2020. Next one, please. So for developing these models to reach carbon neutrality or GHG neutrality by 2050, we have to first develop sectorial scenarios. So we gather experts of each different scenarios to see which measures are feasible, technically feasible by 2050. And we draw pathways for each of these measures. Next one, please. So, for example, the decarbonization of the electricity matrix, we see how it will go till we want to reach 100% of decarbonized matrix by 2050, and we see technically what is feasible to do in the pathway. But as the next one, to reach this goal by 2050, so there are many different pathways, but as we have the NDC in between, there is an additional political will to do things faster. So we don't want to decarbonize by the end of the mid-century, but sooner. So not only what is feasible technically, but also we want to set targets in the NDC that are also aligned with the global stocktake and with other political movements. So these pathways are developed thinking on both long-term and short-term with NDCs. And next one, please. So we do these scenarios for each measure of each sectorial with each sectorial team, and then we develop this map course to see, so to evaluate the cost, how much it will cost, and also we evaluate the benefits. And it's different to do this if you think till 2030 or till 2035 or till 2050. So you have sometimes different map curves. It doesn't change much, but it can be different. And usually if you evaluate scenarios, also the cost and benefits, in the longer term, you have more benefits. And if you only see in the very short term, you will have more costs than benefits. So it's very important to see which time frame we are looking when you decide which measures you want to do first. And next one, please. So now the next one. We put all these measures together and we see the feasible pathways to reach carbon neutrality by 2050. This curve only does not go to zero because we have our LULUCF sector is a capture net. So we have important captures from that sector and also measures in that sector, but we analyze that sector separately from the emissions. And what I wanted to show here is that we do not only have to align the NDC or the new NDC with the 2050 goal, but also with the current NDC, because we have a current goal, and when we set that goal 5 years ago, we had different information on the inventory or on pathways. So the new analysis we have to break in 2030. So we have to see first how to meet the short-term, the shorter goal for 2030, and then what will be our new goal for 2035, and then align that with the long-term goal. So it's not only aligning long-term, but also with the very short-term with the different information. Yeah, so the next one, that was my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Camila. This was very insightful on the experience of Chile with alignment. And just now at the end, you made a really crucial point about not only focusing on formulating the new NDC, but also doing a bit of a stock take of what's been done so far on previous NDC and their implementation, and really integrating that into the next round. So thank you for that. I'll now move to Meli Firat Ayaz from the Directorate of Climate Change in Turkey, who similarly to Camila is going to explain to us some of the practical steps that were taken in Turkey to align both processes. So over to you, Meli.
Thanks so much, Sarah. I hope you hear me clearly. So my name is Meli. I am an urban planner. I work for the Directorate of Climate Change in Turkey, and thanks so much for inviting us here to talk about our experience in developing NDC and LTS and alignment of short-term and long-term climate policies. First of all, I would like to briefly explain the architecture of public strategic planning in Turkey. So since 1960s, we have these 5-year development plans produced by the formerly state planning agency, which is now the Strategy and Budget Bureau. And we are right now in the period of 12 development plan. So the main function of this plan is basically to set the national development targets and then to serve as a primary guidance for the transformation of the economy towards these goals. But of course, country also needed a long-term vision. So in the year 2001, we developed the first long-term development strategy for a 20 years period, basically alongside the 8 national development plan. So these two documents are basically the backbone of strategic planning in Turkey and every other, like documents produced by other ministries. So as you can see, Turkey has a kind of, like a long tradition of developing long-term and short-term policies and establish institutional arrangements and mechanisms to basically secure their alignment to a certain extent. And where does climate action fit, within this broader policy-making framework? So the first reference to climate change and initial climate policies was made for the first long-term development strategy in 2001. So 2001 was a turning point for us, and afterwards we started, making steps towards integration of climate policies into sectoral policies, and also establishing climate action coordination mechanism among the public institutions. And then, of course, after this, we, fast forward into 2021, let's say, which is another turning point for us in Turkey. We finally ratified the Paris Agreement and declared our net zero emissions goal for 2053. 2021 was also another turning point for us. So we established the Directorate of Climate Change as the leading body for the development of key national climate policy documents, and also the coordinating the climate action across the governments. And so we also have a climate change coordination board with relevant public institutions and representatives from private sector universities. So all the key decisions like NDC targets are made by this board, and head of the board is our Minister of Environment. And now I want to focus more on NDC LTS process. So we developed our first NDC in 2023 with a target of a 41% reduction in emissions compared to business as usual scenario. And then we developed climate change mitigation and adaptation action plans as the implementation tool of the NDC. And then last year, finally, we announced, but here is an interesting development strategy 24 years ago. So last year, the Directorate of Climate Change and the Strategy and Budget Bureau basically worked together and integrated this long-term development strategy into the long-term climate strategy. So we basically merged these two important documents in order to achieve, like a single integrated long-term vision for the country. So this was also an important step for us, and I think that this we kind of completed the structure of having, institutional arrangements and mechanisms in place for a well-coordinated action on climate and development in Turkey. So we have long-term climate strategy, we have 5-year development plans, we have NDC targets, and we have sectoral action plans basically to achieve these targets. So this is the overall structure. And now I want to focus more on the challenges we face, maybe, when it comes to the alignment of these short-term and long-term policies. And I want to particularly focus on one big challenge, and I think there are many other issues and challenges that are strongly tied to this one. As I tried to explain, we have these institutional arrangements for the alignment of long-term and short-term climate and development policies. Probably one of the biggest challenges the governments face all around the world is institutional fragmentation. And in Turkey, I think, I would say we made progress on that front, but What we have been struggling the most right now is maybe developing, this is particularly the case for long-term policies, developing effective policies that can drive and like sustain basically change in the economy in the long run, but towards the right direction. Why I am saying this is because the main function of long-term policies is basically to inform and guide the short-term policies. So here, I think we are facing a problem, particularly, let's say 20, 30 years ago, like when we first started implementing climate policies or let's say renewable energy policies, it was, in my opinion, quite easy, to put solar panels on roofs and maybe like a wind turbines in countryside, etc. But right now we are also talking about grid expansions, different type of battery technologies, demand side management, heat pumps, green hydrogen, small modular reactors, and carbon capture and storage. So the first question, like often people ask us is where to start. But I think the following question is more challenging. Where will it go? So in this regard, there are many uncertainties regarding the future macroeconomic and energy outlooks in the world. I mean, socio-technical transitions are interestingly challenging, but on top of that, we have let's say more exogenous issues like geopolitical tensions, conflicts, economic volatility, changing global dynamics, making things much more complicated for us. So I think at this point, especially this is the case for Turkey, what we need is basically to have a highly advanced capacity to see the future, basically taking all the risk and issues into account. This requires a great ability to basically do a robust and database, maybe strategic planning, and that can also like incorporate different assumptions, risk factors, and global uncertainties, let's say. So what we are doing in Turkey right now, we are trying to enhance our institutional capacity in terms of like a modeling capabilities and strategic foresight practices, let's say. Basically we are trying to strengthen our institutional data management and modeling infrastructure to support policy evidence-based policy making, basically. So I think this is one of the key aspects of like for the alignment of short-term and long-term policies, because I think this alignment presents many opportunities, particularly towards the implementation side, because stronger long-term policies mean stronger, or let's say investable and actionable short-term policies. And I think I want to make this point as well. International collaboration is extremely important here due to the lack of capacity in major part of the world. And there is also this risk for the international context as well. Like some countries with great political, technological, or financial power, basically trying to use this kind of uncertainties, and I mentioned to their advantages, maybe like trying to control more supply chains, or like maybe setting standards, etc. But I think, or I believe, the focus should be given more towards international collaboration and solidarity. We need more like open platforms, basically like a knowledge sharing, capacity building, technology transfer. We need basically joint visioning, mutual support, and collective action, basically. So that's it from me. But before ending my part, actually, and speaking of international collaboration, I would like to specially thank to 2050 Pathways platform for their support for Turkey, strengthening LTS work towards implementation. We just concluded a project with them. We organized many events and activities, basically, for national and local institutions and general public to get a better understanding of overall climate objectives, but particularly the long-term vision of the country towards a net zero goal. And that's it from me. Thanks so much for listening.
Thank you very much, Millie. And likewise, it's been a real pleasure to work with the OCC on the formulation of your LT-LEDs. And thank you also for highlighting some of the honest challenges that Turkey is facing, and also some of the solutions that you guys have implemented, especially around institutional capacity you mentioned, and we may be able to delve into this in the Q&A. So we've heard some fantastic presentations, and thank you again to all of our speakers. It's been really fascinating hearing from you. We're now ready to open for a Q&A session, so please feel free to continue submitting questions through the Q&A tool at the bottom of your screen. We've already received quite a few questions. We'll select some of them to answer today, and we're trying to work our way through them, but please bear with us. But perhaps turning to Clea and Kieran first, and we have a question around the benchmarks that you presented, and really kind of highlighting that with many different benchmarks at different levels, how can you assess whether an NDC target is ambitious enough? Is that something you've already looked into?
Thanks, Sarah. I can come in on this one, and thank you for the question. The short answer is that it's complicated. That's why we did this analysis. We figure that by compiling the benchmarks that are out there and have been put out into the world by credible modeling, modeling techniques and studies and groups, and organizing them into these categories, we can help countries to answer questions like, what is ambitious when compared to a least cost approach to achieve 1.5 degrees? What is ambitious when compared to a fair share-based contribution to 1.5 degrees? So we do not make any prescriptive ultimate, we do not offer any prescriptive advice in the piece about what the final ambitious target would need to be. We just offer the context that countries and others in the international community alike can use to answer those questions of what's ambitious and what goes far enough from each of these discrete perspectives. And hopefully that is kind of a tool that can thereby be used by countries in the international community alike to get a sense of what goes far enough. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Clea. Kieran, did you want to add to this? No, perfect answer. Great. Perhaps turning to Anna as well on the framework that you presented, and thinking about how can least developed countries with, capacity challenges and perhaps weak implementation policies can more easily align the NDC goals with the LT-LEDs or any other national long-term planning that may be Paris aligned, that may have reference to the Paris Agreement. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that.
Oh, first of all, to say that the challenge is true and is difficult, and Millie was also pointing at that support needed and thanking the platform for the support that exists through other channels, to many channels, but of course there will be need for more, of course. Here, where I see the value of LT-LEDs is that it helps provide a long-term vision for the country that really goes beyond just trying to achieve the climate goals. If the LT-LEDs is done from a country perspective with consulting the civil society, including local experts and including the different parts of the government, things like this, can help develop a long-term vision of where the country wants to go. And this can be combined with development goals. It can include things like jobs, and it can include sectors of the economy that you want to develop, things like this. So here we're having, it can be a long-term vision. It doesn't have to be a full modeling long-term LT-LEDs, let's say, but where it would be very useful for these countries with more limited capacity, because it would help align all these different policies and have a vision of where they want to go, regardless if it's climate or development. That's a positive answer to the question.
No, absolutely. Thank you, Anna. Perhaps turning to Camilla next, and thank you again for highlighting the approach taken by Chile. I had a question around perhaps the stakeholder engagement process across the NDC and LT-LEDs. Was there an effort from the government to try and combine both of these in the process of updating the NDC or revising the LT-LEDs, or are you looking into this at the moment as a potential next step of, okay, how do we bring different stakeholders, but also, you know, avoid things like stakeholder fatigue and over-engage stakeholders to the point where it's not an effective process? I wonder if you've had some thoughts about that at the ministry. Thank you.
Yeah, that's a real issue. But first of all, I wanted to mention something that Emily said already, and Anna as well, that we are only able to do this modeling processes because we have international financing help to hire experts to do this. So if we wouldn't have this international collaboration, we wouldn't be able to have this kind of processes, to have more informed and aligned NDCs and LLTs. And yeah, regarding this, so it's something that we want to do, but we haven't implemented it yet. Our NDC is currently in a public consultation, which is for 3 months. It finishes now in the 11th of April. And by law, also our long-term climate strategy will have to have its own 3 months public consultation. But in the workshops that we have been doing, we are not talking only about NDCs, but like NDCs and long-term views, and also COP30. So we like put all of the climate action package together in the workshops. So it's not like otherwise people don't understand like why we're talking again about this if we did this like 3 months ago. And we will of course try to use what we many things that we observations that we get for the NDC are not proper to be in the NDC because they are sometimes too specific or long term, and they correspond to other instruments from the framework law. So the idea is to get these observations and to keep them to be internalized in the corresponding plans. Yes.
No, that makes complete sense, and thanks, Camilla, for outlining the approach you're taking on stakeholder engagement. I'm going to turn to Melih next, and I'm curious to understand from you and Turkey's perspective, what role do finance plans, and I think the question that came in mean kind of national finance plans, in enabling alignment between short-term and long-term strategies. And so you mentioned, you know, Turkey developed some institutional capacity to support this process of grouping the policies. Was there an effort to look into financing plans as well? Or again, similarly to what I was asking Camilla, is this something that you are thinking about in the pipeline of alignment in the country?
Yeah, that's actually on point question. I think financing NDCs and like LTS and overall climate policies is also like a great challenge next to the institutional challenges as well. So what we have been doing in Turkey is
Melih, I think we're losing you a little bit.
First,
can you hear us?
Oh, really? You cannot hear me now?
No,
my
can.
connection is not stable, I guess. No,
yeah.
my video. Okay, you cannot see me, but you can hear me, right? Okay, it's nice.
We can hear you now a little bit better. We left you at the very beginning of your intervention, so please feel free to start the answer from the beginning. Thank you.
Okay, I'll start from beginning here. So financing is also another challenge next to the institutional challenges I mentioned. So thanks so much for asking that question. So what we have been doing in Turkey is basically first, we are trying to adjust the climate policies in a way that we can finance them later, basically. So we are basically looking for ways to basically achieve more, implementable, investable climate policies, or maybe we are prioritizing them, let's say. So that is one side. The other side is basically we are also developing, next to these climate policies, we are also developing a financing strategies as well. Right now we are in the phase of finalizing our finance strategy for NDC and LTS as well, as far as I'm concerned. So I guess this document is going to be a great base for us for future climate policy making. What we do else is also we just develop our national green taxonomy. And this is going to be in line with EU taxonomy. And I think this taxonomy will provide us a great opportunity basically to like a channel important investment into the right activities, and I guess it's going to stir up like a more investment for green transition, I guess, in the country as well. So this is going to be part of the climate law, draft climate law in Turkey. It's in the parliamentary process right now. If the law passes the parliamentary process, we are going to have this national green taxonomy. We are going to also have emissions trading system. It's going to be another market-based tool for us to basically raise money for green transition. So I can talk about these, but I want to mention this as well. We are developing the second NDC this year. We are going to submit it hopefully by September, but let's see. What we are going to do after this, we are going to look back to LTS as well, and then we are going to develop basically project pipelines, sectoral project pipelines or project portfolios, let's say. So it's going to be basically prioritizing, like a certain projects and link them to, like a certain mitigation and adaptation impacts or benefits, basically. And then we are going to try to finance these actions first. So as I said in the beginning, we are basically trying to adjust the policy-making process for financial mechanisms as well. So this is going to be the main product of that process. Basically, we are going to have this project portfolio, and also in Turkey, I mentioned Strategy and Budget Bureau. So every year, this bureau releases annual investment program. So we try to put as much, like a green projects possible as possible in this investment program, basically. And if we have this, like a project portfolio, and then if we have these investment strategies, we will have more green projects in the program. So yeah, this is overall maybe structure of financing in Turkey.
Thank you, Melih. That's very comprehensive, and it's really interesting to hear about the different tools that can kind of, I guess, enhance investability into the LT-LEDs and the NDC, but also taking into consideration the realities that Camilla were mentioning of also international finance and the availability of international finance, but already thinking also about other sources, private sector investment and so on, having that financing plan that can really showcase what is your roadmap and what do you need to get there. It is really helpful in attracting this capacity. We actually have a lot of questions, which is great to see. We have a very engaged audience today. So I'm actually going to do a second round of questions with everyone. And again, starting with Clea and Kieran. I've lost it now. I've lost my questions. Oh yeah, bear with me. So could you tell us a little bit more about the fair share pathways? I think there was a lot of interest from the audience about this. Would the pathways actually be lower than other pathways for any countries? And how are you defining the pathways in the first place? If you could give a bit of insight into it, it'd be great. Thank you.
Sure. And it's a good question to ask, because if you're looking at some of the graphs you presented, you're going, okay, why are the fair share pathways in a different graph and why are they so much lower? And so the fair share pathways that we have, they're from two main sources. One is the Climate Action Tracker's effort sharing assessment, and the other is from the Climate Equity Reference Projects calculator. And both, they use a similar method, which is they take a global carbon budget that complies with 1.5 degrees Celsius, and that comes from a large integrated assessment model. So some of the modeling that the IPCC does to determine what trajectories are that are compliant with 1.5 degrees Celsius. They take a global carbon budget, so how many emissions we need to comply with that, and they assign it to various countries based on primarily historical emissions, and so that's a proxy for historical responsibility. So countries who emit more should be contributing more to carbon abatement or emissions reductions in the future. And then also capacity. And so that takes into account income, so like GDP per capita for countries. So those are that's how it's calculated. And so as a result, this means that countries that have either contributed very little to climate change or that or which are not as developed, they would have lower contributions under a fair share pathway than countries that are wealthier and have contributed more to climate change historically. And so it's a way of kind of normalizing emissions reduction pathways for previous differences in historical emissions and capacity. So I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Kieran, for this overview. I'll turn to Anna again next on the alignment framework. We have quite a few, but I think this one is interesting. What would you align your NDC to your LT-LEDs if your LT-LEDs is not ambitious enough, and how do you address that? Do you have any thoughts on this, Anna?
This is a very good question because, of course, it depends on what's happening specifically in the country. So we will talk about like ideal situations, but we don't see an LTS or an LT-LEDs like a finished product that you will never touch again. So LT-LEDs are something that you can keep revising, and maybe on that question, the country did think it was ambitious enough, it's just that the circumstances have changed. So let's imagine that's the case, and you have an LT-LEDs that now was giving, I don't know, a date for neutrality that now has been brought forward, or like now you develop more policies that are more ambitious or things like this. You can now revise your LT-LEDs, and some countries have already started doing that or done that to reflect the more ambitious moment that you are in now. And that is where then aligning it with the NDC makes sense. So in this sense, what I was presenting in the presentation and what the framework advocates is, once you have these LT-LEDs that really looks at the most ambitious you can be reflecting the Paris Agreement goals, then it's good to like backcast, right? Look back at the more current moment and derive an NDC that aligns with that. So yeah, this is a way to say LT-LEDs are not set in stone, and then they can be revised, of course.
Thank you so much, Anna, and a very valid response. And to complement that, I know experiences with countries at the platform, we see, a case where the country obviously is now prompted to update their NDC, and some countries are genuinely then thinking, well, I need to look into my LT-LEDs and whether it still makes sense. And then we see revision process being generated this year from that kind of a need to update the NDC, and therefore governments do see the value in doing both updates at the same time, even if also there are countries when unfortunately there is a mismatch in the timelines. But thank you for that. Camilla, I'm turning to you. I have a question about Chile and particularly about how you guys have gone about setting up the institutional capacity, which has supported both the update of NDCs as well as the review of the country's LT-LEDs, and how have you kind of sustained this institutional capacity to monitor these processes together?
Yeah, so well, it has been a process since so the capacity for projections, it started 10 years ago with the MAPS projects that were first talking with the different ministries, and we have been able to maintain some of these capacities, mostly within the ministry, it's still very hard to create these capacities within the sectorial ministries, and moreover the subnationals are like very hard. But within the ministry, we have been able to maintain some of the capacities, but we're still working on it. For our national GHG inventory system, this system, we created it in 2012, so a long time ago, and we have been able to have national, not so international consultants, but national people within the ministry that work in the inventory, so we are able to sustain and maintain and improve over time the inventory. Whereas with the projections, we are now starting to have a more formal system, and we hope with this we will be also able to maintain and to improve in time these projections.
No, thank you. That makes sense, Camilla. Thank you. And then maybe turning to you again on Turkey's experience. And I wonder if you have any insight on kind of the involvement of subnationals as well and the alignment process. And I guess in the broader policy formulation for LT-LEDs and NDCs, I guess here in the case of Turkey, like what has been the involvement of subnational, and how can subnational entities in Turkey translate the kind of plans that are emerging at the national level? Don't know if you have any thoughts on this.
Okay, I just stopped my video again. Yeah, thanks so much for the question. I mentioned the climate law, right? It's in the parliamentary process. So one of the things this climate law will bring is local climate action plans. So it's going to be compulsory for all 81 provinces of Turkey. So each provincial municipality has to deliver these action plans, I guess, till 2027, or I don't remember clearly. So I guess this is kind of like another addition to the strategic planning structure I mentioned. I tried to explain. So we have this national, like structure, and then we are building the sub-national structure through these local action plans. So in local action plans, the municipalities will be the main agent, but they will form local councils like the one we have, local coordination councils like the one we have for national climate change coordination board. So these local councils or local boards will be basically responsible for setting targets, setting like policies, etc. And the municipality will be the like implementation body basically in this regard. And then, of course, as the national, like bodies for climate action, we will help municipalities to basically, like enhance their capacity to develop their own maybe modeling capabilities and projection scenarios for their cities, basically. And what we want to do after this, basically, to develop kind of like a feedback loop between these national policy documents and local policy documents to basically align them. So it's going to be another challenge for us for the alignment of climate policies, I guess. After this short and long-term policies, we also have to look into the national and sub-national policies as well. So it's going to be another challenge, but another good dynamics for us, I guess, to strengthen our climate ambitions.
No, thank you, Melly. And we know there's been a lot of efforts as well on training and raising awareness with subnational entities in Turkey around the LT-LEDs and the objectives of the LT-LEDs. So it's great to hear that this has been continued, and the subnational engagement in relation to the LT-LEDs and NDCs is always quite a challenge across geographies. So thank you. Okay. I think we have, obviously, there were many more questions, and thank you to all participants for submitting those. I think we will close the Q&A now, obviously, to just make sure we have enough time to also close the session. But thank you so much to all the speakers for the presentations again, and for answering those questions so honestly and sharing your experiences. I think it's been a really productive session. I've really enjoyed how we've heard first about experts that have really kind of showcased potential tools that other experts or even countries, governments can leverage in the alignment of NDCs and LTLEDs, and then really zooming into the practicalities of alignment with our colleagues from Chile and Turkey, and really understanding what has been done on the ground in countries to align LTLEDs and NDCs. So thank you so much for your presentations and your contributions, and thank you to all the participants for joining the session and for submitting so many questions. It's been fascinating to read all of these, and I wish we could answer all of them. Before we close the session, I just wanted to also highlight the next webinar of this series. And I can see the slides being shared. Great, thank you. We have our third webinar of the 2050 is Now series that will be announced very soon. It's likely to take place at the end of April, and it will focus on just transitions in long-term climate strategies. So again, this will be delivered under the 2050 is Now project, and we hope it will be a fascinating session. So we'll keep you updated about